For 6 years, a man named Daniel Ruiz locked the doors of a courthouse every night at 11, checked the windows, walked the dark hallway past Courtroom 4, and went home to study for a test that kept telling him he didn't belong there. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't even close, on paper. He was the night security guard, working the second of two jobs that kept the lights on while he tried, and failed, and tried again to pass the bar exam. For times, the results came back the same way. For times, he sat in his car in that same courthouse parking lot, reading a letter that used different words to say the exact same thing. Not yet. Not you. Not this time. Nobody watching him lock those doors at night could have guessed that 15 years later, he would walk back into that same building, take the stairs up past the same hallway, and sit down behind the bench in Courtroom 4. Not as the man who checked if it was locked, but as the judge who decides what happens inside it. This is how a man who failed 4 times became the person presiding over the room he used to guard. Daniel grew up in Tucson, Arizona, in a house that smelled permanently like motor oil because his father, Hector, ran a small auto repair shop 2 blocks from where they lived. Ruiz Auto, the sign said, hand-painted, the kind of business that exists on a handshake and a reputation built one fair repair bill at a time. Hector wasn't a businessman by training. He was a mechanic who'd gotten good enough and trusted enough that customers started asking him to just open his own place instead of working for someone else. He did, in 1989, with a loan from a cousin and a level of optimism that Daniel, even as a kid, could tell wasn't entirely matched by his father's understanding of how loans actually worked. For a while, it was fine. Then it wasn't. A new chain repair shop opened up on the main road with financing Hector couldn't compete with, advertising budgets that dwarfed his entire annual revenue, and the slow bleed began. Fewer customers, then late payments to suppliers, then a second loan to cover the first one. The kind of decision that feels necessary in the moment and catastrophic in hindsight. By the time Daniel was 12, men in suits Daniel didn't recognize were coming by the shop with documents his father couldn't fully read, without his reading glasses and a great deal of squinting, asking him to sign things that Daniel would only understand the weight of years later. The shop closed when Daniel was 13. He remembers the specific Tuesday, not because anyone told him directly what was happening, but because his father came home early for the first time in Daniel's memory, sat at the kitchen table, and didn't get up for almost 2 hours. What stayed with Daniel longest wasn't the loss of the shop itself. It was watching his father get outmaneuvered, again and again, by paperwork. Hector wasn't unintelligent. He could diagnose an engine problem from the sound of it idling in a parking lot. But contracts, loan terms, the fine print that buried the actual cost of borrowing money. That language belonged to a different world, one designed, it seemed to Daniel, even as a kid, to be understood only by the people who already had the advantage. He decided, somewhere in the year after the shop closed, that he was going to learn that language. Not to get rich, just so nobody could ever do to him, or to people like his father, what had just been done to Hector Ruiz over a kitchen table he never got up from. Hector found work eventually, 6 months after the shop closed, at the very chain repair franchise that had driven him out of business, changing oil and rotating tires for a manager 15 years younger than him who'd never once turned a wrench himself. He took the job because the alternative was nothing, and because Daniel's mother had picked up 2 cleaning jobs to cover the gap, and a man can only watch that happen for so long before pride stops being something he can afford. He never complained about it at home, not directly, but Daniel noticed the way his father's shoulders sat differently after that, like a man carrying something he'd decided not to put down in front of his kids. Daniel spent a lot of afternoons that year at the public library 2 blocks from their apartment, partly because it was free and partly because his mother worked late and the library closed later than most places that would let a 13-year-old just sit. He'd pull repair manuals off the shelf sometimes, trying to understand the trade his father had lost, and he remembers, even then, how much longer it took him to get through a paragraph than it seemed to take the other kids at the same table. He didn't have a word for why. He just assumed everyone found reading exactly this exhausting, and that some people were simply better at hiding it. It took Daniel almost a decade longer than it takes most people to turn that decision into a law degree, and nearly every extra year of that decade had a specific, ordinary reason behind it. He worked through community college taking night classes because days were for the warehouse job that paid actual rent. He transferred to a four-year university at 23, older than most of his classmates, carrying a course load split unevenly around two part-time jobs that never quite added up to enough. By the time he got into a law school that would take him, not a top-tier school, a regional one with a reasonable acceptance rate and a less reasonable price tag, he was 27, married to a woman named Priya who believed in this plan more some weeks than others, and entirely without family money to cushion any part of the next 3 years. Law school itself nearly broke him financially before it broke him academically. He took out loans he tried not to think about in concrete numbers, because thinking about them in concrete numbers made it hard to breathe. To cover the gap between loans and rent, he took the overnight security job at the county courthouse the summer before his second year, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., for nights a week, walking the same hallways, locking the same doors, reading casebooks at a guard's desk under a single fluorescent light that buzzed audibly enough that he eventually stopped noticing it. On the 2 nights he wasn't at the courthouse, he drove for a rideshare app until exhaustion made it unsafe to keep driving, which some weeks was closer to dawn than he liked to admit to Priya. He graduated on a Saturday in May, walked across a stage, shook a dean's hand, and was back behind the courthouse security desk by 11 p.m. the following Tuesday, because diplomas don't pay rent and the bar exam was 4 months away and somebody still had to lock those doors at night. He studied during every break the job allowed him, sometimes 20 minutes at a stretch, sometimes less, building a legal education out of fragments stolen between rounds of a building that was, very slowly, starting to feel more like his future than his job description suggested it should. By graduation, Daniel's law school debt sat just under $190,000, a number he and Priya avoided saying out loud in full, opting instead for euphemisms like the number or all of it, as though naming it precisely might make it more real than it already was. They'd married in his second year, in a courthouse ceremony, not the one he'd eventually work nights in, with 12 people in attendance and a cake from a grocery store bakery, because anything bigger felt dishonest given what they both knew was coming financially. The night security job itself was unglamorous in a way that doesn't always come across afterward, once a story has a tidy shape to it. It meant 8-hour shifts walking the same 6 hallways on a loop, checking door handles that were almost always already locked, filling out an incident log that usually just said, "no incidents," and trying to read casework by the light of a desk lamp the building's day staff would have considered a fire hazard if anyone had ever checked. Daniel kept a thermos of coffee that was mostly for staying conscious rather than staying alert, and he developed, without meaning to, an intimate knowledge of which floor tiles squeaked, which courtroom doors stuck in humid weather, and what the building sounded like in the specific hour before dawn when even the pipes seemed to go quiet. What Daniel didn't know yet, what nobody had ever told him, in 27 years of school, including 3 years of law school, was that he had dyslexia. Undiagnosed, unnamed, just quietly, persistently making every timed, text-heavy exam of his entire life harder than it had any right to be for someone who understood the actual material as well as he did. It had shown up his whole life in ways he'd learned to route around without ever knowing what he was routing around. In elementary school, teachers called him a slow reader and left it there, the explanation apparently sufficient on its own. He developed elaborate compensations nobody taught him on purpose, reading test questions twice, sometimes 3 times, before trusting that he'd actually absorbed what they were asking. Rereading his own written answers out loud, silently, lips barely moving, to catch words his eyes had quietly rearranged on the page without his permission. He was sharp in conversation, quick in argument, the kind of person who could take apart someone else's reasoning in real time at a dinner table. Put the exact same reasoning in front of him on paper, under a clock, and something in the translation between his brain and the page would slow down, scramble, cost him minutes he didn't have to spare. He'd built an entire identity around this without a name for it. He assumed, the way a lot of undiagnosed adults do, that this was just what being not quite smart enough felt like from the inside, that everyone else found time reading this exhausting and simply pushed through it better than he did. He never once, across 27 years, considered that his brain might be processing language through a different, harder route than most people's, because nobody had ever suggested that explanation existed. The bar exam, it turned out, was almost a perfect machine for exposing exactly this particular weakness. 2 full days. Hundreds of multiple-choice questions under brutal time pressure. Essays that demanded fast reading, fast analysis, fast writing, with almost no margin for a brain that needed an extra beat on every single sentence to make sure it had actually read what was on the page. Daniel would later say that the bar exam never tested whether he understood the law. It tested how fast he could decode English under stress. And for years, that was a different skill entirely from the one he actually had. In 3rd grade, a teacher named Mrs. Albrecht asked him to read a paragraph aloud in front of the class, the way teachers did back then without thinking much about it. And Daniel remembers the specific paragraph swimming in front of him, letters seeming to hold still for everyone else and not for him. He stumbled through it while a few kids snickered, and Mrs. Albrecht, not unkindly, just suggested he practice more at home. He practiced. It didn't get faster. It just got better hidden, which isn't the same thing, though nobody around him seemed to know the difference existed. In law school, he learned to sit near the back of exam rooms, partly so nobody would notice how many times his eyes moved back over the same line of a fact pattern before it settled into something he trusted he'd actually read correctly. He used a ruler under each line on practice exams, an old trick a college tutor had shown him without either of them ever using the word dyslexia, just calling it helping you focus, and it helped enough that Daniel assumed, reasonably, that this was simply what studying hard looked like for someone who wasn't naturally gifted at it. The first failure came as a number on a website, refreshed obsessively at midnight on results day, the way every state bar exam result arrives now. No phone call, no letter waiting at the kitchen table, just a screen that loads a pass or fail status while your hands are too unsteady to hold the mouse properly. Fail. Daniel had scored close. Close enough that everyone around him, including the bar prep company that had taken several $1,000s of his loan money, told him this was actually encouraging, a sign he just needed to adjust his approach slightly and try again in 6 months. He believed them, mostly because believing them was easier than the alternative, which was sitting with the actual feeling of having spent 3 years and tens of thousands of dollars in debt to fail a test that decided, with one number, whether any of it had been worth it. He told almost no one outside his immediate family. Priya knew, obviously, and absorbed the news the way she'd absorbed most of the last 6 years, steady on the outside, privately doing her own math on what another 6 months of his unlicensed status meant for 2 incomes that were both already stretched thin. His father took it harder than Daniel expected, not with disappointment exactly, but with a particular quiet that Daniel recognized from the year the shop closed. The look of a man watching his kid hit the same kind of wall he'd hit himself, except this wall had multiple-choice questions instead of loan documents. He registered for the next exam 4 days after getting the first result, because waiting felt like giving the failure room to become permanent instead of temporary. He kept working both jobs. He kept locking the courthouse doors at 11, walking past Courtroom 4, telling himself, with less conviction each time, that he'd be standing on the other side of that bench eventually. If he just put in enough hours studying at a guard's desk under a buzzing fluorescent light that, for months later, would watch him fail for the second time. The exact number stuck with him for years afterward. He'd missed the cut score by 4 points out of roughly 1,400 possible, the kind of margin that bar prep companies love to point to as proof you were almost there, as though 4 points were a small thing rather than the entire distance between being a lawyer and not being one. The company that had taken Daniel's loan money offered him a discounted re-enrollment rate for his next attempt, framed as a gesture of confidence in him, though Daniel would later realize it was simply standard practice, offered to nearly everyone who failed, confidence having very little to do with it. He and Priya sat on their apartment floor that night, surrounded by the moving boxes they still hadn't fully unpacked from a move 8 months earlier, and didn't say much for a long while. She finally asked him, carefully, whether he wanted to talk about what came next or just sit there, and he told her honestly that he didn't know which one he needed yet. She didn't push. She just sat with him on the floor until almost midnight, her hand resting on his knee, both of them staring at a wall they'd never gotten around to hanging anything on. Hector called the next morning, the way he always did after results came out, not to ask how Daniel had done because he already knew from the silence on the other end of the first ring, but just to say he was proud of him for taking the test at all, a sentence Daniel didn't fully believe his father meant in that moment, and one he wouldn't fully believe himself for several more years. The second failure hurt differently than the first. The first time, failure had felt like bad luck, a number that landed 1 point short of where it needed to be. The second time, it started to feel like information, the kind of pattern that makes a person wonder if they're chasing something that was never built for them in the first place. Daniel switched bar prep courses, paying for a more expensive program with money he and Priya didn't actually have. The kind of decision you make when you've convinced yourself the previous failure was the method's fault and not some deeper problem you haven't identified yet. He restructured his study schedule around the security job instead of squeezed in between its shifts. He cut back further on sleep, which was already thin, until Priya started quietly tracking how many hours he was actually getting, worried less about the exam at that point than about what the attempt to pass it was doing to him physically. The third attempt failed too. By then, the math around them had become impossible to ignore politely. 3 failed attempts meant 3 bar prep course fees, 3 exam registration fees, 3 sets of lost wages on the days he couldn't work because he was sitting in a testing center for 8 hours, on top of a law school debt load that had started accruing interest the moment he graduated, license or no license. Daniel's mother, visiting for a holiday that year, asked him gently, the way mothers ask the questions everyone else is too afraid to, whether maybe this particular path simply wasn't meant for him, and whether there was dignity in deciding that himself before the test decided it for him a 4th time. Daniel didn't have a good answer for her that night. He went back to work 2 days later, locked the courthouse doors at 11, and stood for a long moment outside Courtroom 4 in the dark, doing the kind of math that has nothing to do with numbers. The math of how much of yourself you're willing to keep spending on a door that keeps not opening, and whether there's a difference between persistence and refusing to admit something that everyone around you can already see. The new prep course cost almost $4,000 more than the one he'd used the first time. Money they put on a credit card because the loan disbursements were long gone and there was no other place left to pull it from. Daniel restructured his entire week around it, waking at 5 in the morning before his rideshare shifts to do timed practice sets, falling asleep some nights still holding a highlighter, Priya gently prying it out of his hand before turning off the lamp. He was running, by his own later estimate, on something close to 5 hours of sleep a night for the better part of 4 months, a pace that made him irritable in ways he wasn't proud of, and that put a strain on the marriage neither of them talked about directly until years later. His mother's questioned that holiday wasn't cruel, and it didn't come from nowhere. She'd watched her son disappear into a kitchen table covered in flashcards for 3 consecutive Thanksgivings, watched Priya smile, get a little thinner each year, And she asked it the way you'd ask someone to consider stepping back from a ledge, not the way you'd ask someone to quit. I just want you to choose this because you still want it, she told him, not because you're afraid of what it means to stop. Daniel didn't have an answer that night. He said since that it took him almost a full year to figure out which one of those two things had actually been true. The fourth failure was the one that nearly ended it. Daniel was 33 years old. He had a law degree, 6 figures of debt attached to it, 2 jobs that had nothing to do with that degree, and a results page that had now told him no for separate times. He stopped registering for the next exam immediately, for the first time in this process. He let weeks pass without deciding anything, which for a man who'd spent a decade meticulously planning every next step was its own kind of crisis. What kept him upright during that stretch wasn't ambition. It was a habit he'd developed quietly over his years at the courthouse, one he never mentioned to anyone, including Priya. Working nights. Daniel saw the building empty out after hours into something most daytime visitors never witness. The people waiting alone outside night arraignment processing, family members who'd driven hours and had nowhere to sit, defendants too poor to make bail, sitting and holding with nobody coming for them at all. Daniel started keeping a box of granola bars and bottled water in his guard station, not because anyone asked him to, and quietly leaving a few with anyone who looked like they hadn't eaten since morning. He never gave his name. He never made it a conversation. He'd just set it down, say this building doesn't feed people enough, and keep walking his rounds. He kept doing that through the worst of the fourth failure stretch, mostly, he admitted years later, because it was the one part of his life connected to that courthouse that still felt like it was working. He couldn't pass the test that was supposed to let him help people from behind a podium, but he could still hand a scared 18-year-old's grandmother a bottle of water at 1 in the morning while she waited to find out if her grandson was coming home that night. It wasn't law. It felt, some nights, like the only part of the law he was actually managing to practice. It was during one of those quiet 1 a.m. rounds, 3 weeks into not having registered for a fifth attempt, that an older man in a rumpled cardigan, sitting alone on a bench outside Courtroom, 4 well past when anyone with normal business should have still been in the building, asked Daniel if he had a minute to talk. One night that he remembered clearly years later, an elderly woman had been sitting on the hard bench outside intake processing since 9 p.m., waiting for word on her grandson, who'd been picked up on a warrant tied to missed court dates from a citation he'd never fully understood in the first place. Daniel brought her a bottle of water and one of the granola bars around midnight, and she thanked him, assuming he was some kind of clerk, and asked him if he knew anything about what happens next. He didn't, not officially, but he sat with her for 10 minutes anyway and explained, as best he understood it from years of watching the process from the hallway, what an arraignment was and roughly how long these things usually took. She held his hand for a second before he left to keep walking his rounds, and told him he had a kind way about him. He thought about that sentence more than he expected to in the weeks that followed. Those weeks without a registration date felt, to Daniel, like standing in a hallway with no doors in it. He wasn't quitting, not formally, but he wasn't moving forward either, and the in-between was its own particular misery, one that didn't have the clean shape of failure or the clean shape of giving up, just a long gray stretch where Priya kept gently asking if he'd thought any more about a fifth attempt, and Daniel kept saying he was thinking, which had stopped being entirely true. The man's name was Harold Whitfield, and he'd been a judge in that courthouse for 19 years, the kind of fixture so permanent that even the security guards just called him Judge Whitfield instead of by his actual rank, because there was only ever the one. He often stayed late finishing paperwork, and over Daniel's years on the night shift, they developed the easy, low-stakes familiarity of two people who occupy the same empty building at strange hours. A nod, a comment about the weather, occasionally a longer conversation when Whitfield was in the mood and Daniel's rounds allowed for it. That night, Whitfield asked him directly why he hadn't registered for the next exam date. Daniel, more exhausted than guarded, told him the truth. For failures, a six-figure debt that didn't care how many times he tried, a wife doing math in her head that he could see on her face even when she didn't say it out loud, and a creeping suspicion that his mother might have been right. Whitfield listened the way Daniel had noticed he listened in his own courtroom, without interrupting, without performing concern, just paying actual attention. Then he asked Daniel a question nobody had asked him in 10 years of this process: how he studied. Not what he studied. How. Whitfield had spent 2 decades on the bench watching attorneys argue in front of him, and he developed, almost as a hobby, a sharp eye for the particular kind of intelligent person who stumbled specifically on the written, timed parts of the job while being formidable everywhere else. He'd seen it in law clerks. He'd seen it in one of his own grandsons. He asked Daniel, point blank, if anyone had ever evaluated him for a learning difference. Nobody had. Daniel was 33 years old, and the question had simply never been asked by a teacher, a professor, a bar prep instructor, or anyone else who'd watched him fail the same kind of test 4 times without once wondering why the failure had such a consistent shape to it. Whitfield didn't write Daniel a check or pull any strings that night, and he was careful, deliberately, not to. What he did was quieter and, in its own way, harder to refuse. He wrote down the name and number of a psychologist who specialized in adult learning evaluations, told Daniel that the courthouse's small staff fund could cover part of the assessment cost if he applied through HR without mentioning whose suggestion it had been, and told him to call before he made any decision about giving this up for good. Whitfield had been a public defender himself for a decade before taking the bench, back when the job paid even less relative to the workload than it does now. And he'd spent those years developing a particular radar for the gap between how someone sounded in conversation and how they performed on paper under pressure. His own grandson, Whitfield mentioned to Daniel that night almost as an aside, had struggled through 2 years of community college before a tutor finally suggested testing him for a processing disorder. And the diagnosis had changed, in Whitfield's words, not what the kid was capable of, just what he was finally allowed to prove. Daniel asked him, somewhat defensively, why he was telling him any of this, given that judges weren't exactly supposed to be coaching security guards on their legal careers between shifts. Whitfield just shrugged and said that he'd watched a lot of attorneys argue badly in his courtroom over 19 years, and a lot of clerks and guards talk well in hallways, and the mismatch had started to bother him long before Daniel ever brought it up. I'm not telling you what to do, he said, standing up slowly from the bench outside courtroom 4. I'm telling you there might be a question nobody's asked you yet. That's all. The evaluation took most of a Saturday, 4 hours of tests that felt, to Daniel, uncomfortably similar to the exams that had been failing him for 3 years, except this time, nobody was scoring him pass or fail. They were just trying to understand how his brain actually worked. The diagnosis came back 2 weeks later: moderate to severe dyslexia, compounded by a processing speed disorder that made timed reading specifically, more than almost any other cognitive task, disproportionately difficult for him relative to his actual comprehension and reasoning ability, both of which tested, the psychologist noted almost as an aside, in the superior range. Daniel cried reading that report in his car in the courthouse parking lot, the same parking lot where he'd read 4 rejection letters. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't vindication either, though both were somewhere in the mix. It was something closer to grief for the version of himself that had spent 27 years quietly believing he was simply not as smart as everyone else, when the truth had been that he was running the same race on a track tilted against him the entire time, with no one ever pointing out the tilt. The diagnosis qualified him for testing accommodations on his next bar attempt: extended time, a separate room, technology that read questions aloud while he tracked the text with his eyes, removing some, though never all, of the disadvantage he'd been quietly fighting his whole academic life. Filing the accommodation request meant filling out more paperwork than Daniel had patience for. explaining his own diagnosis to a state bureaucracy that processed thousands of these requests with the same indifferent thoroughness it processed everything else. It took another 3 months just to get approved. The assessment included tests Daniel had never encountered before in 27 years of standardized testing, naming letters and symbols rapidly against a timer, reading nonsense words designed to strip away any advantage from memorized whole word recognition, repeating strings of numbers backward while a clinician timed him with a stopwatch that seemed, to Daniel, unreasonably loud in an otherwise silent room. He left the 4-hour session more exhausted than he'd been after either day of any bar exam attempt, in a way that had nothing to do with content knowledge and everything to do with how much energy his brain had apparently been spending his entire life on a task most people did without noticing they were doing it at all. Filing for accommodations with the state bar took its own kind of endurance. Daniel spent parts of 6 different phone calls on hold with the testing accommodations office, was asked twice to resubmit the same documentation due to a formatting issue nobody could clearly explain to him, and was told at one point that his diagnosis, despite coming from a licensed psychologist with 2 decades of experience, would need a second supplemental letter specifically addressing functional impact on timed legal reasoning tasks, a phrase that didn't exist in any clinical literature his psychologist had ever seen. It took until the week before the registration deadline closed to get final approval, a margin so thin that Daniel had already mentally prepared to take the exam without accommodations rather than risk missing the date entirely. If you've stayed with me this far into Daniel's story, into 4 failures and a diagnosis that came 15 years too late, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day, because this is exactly the kind of story we tell, the slow ones, where the breakthrough isn't a miracle, it's just somebody finally asking the right question. Now let me tell you about the 5th attempt, because everything before it had only been preparation for this one. Daniel studied for the 5th attempt differently than he'd studied for any of the first 4, and the difference wasn't really about the law at all. It was about working with his actual brain instead of quietly fighting it for the 4th time in a row. He used text-to-speech software for every practice exam, letting his ears do part of the work his eyes had always struggled to finish fast enough. He practiced with the extended time allotment from day one, training himself not just in legal content, but in a completely different relationship with the clock, one where he wasn't constantly racing a deadline his brain was never built to beat on the terms the test had always demanded. He kept both jobs through this 5th round of preparation because rent and loan payments didn't pause for a diagnosis, but Priya noticed, for the first time in years, that he came home from late security shifts looking tired in the ordinary way instead of the hollowed-out way she'd grown used to. Results day for the 5th attempt fell on a Tuesday in October. Daniel was at the security desk, technically on shift, when the results posted at 5 p.m. He'd told his supervisor he might need 5 minutes, just in case, and stepped into the small break room with the door mostly closed, his hands shaking in a way that had become its own kind of ritual at this point, for previous failures having trained his body to expect bad news before his mind had even read the screen. He passed, not by a wide margin, not in some triumphant, blow-the-curve way that makes for a better headline. He passed by a comfortable but unremarkable amount, the score of someone who finally got to compete on terms that matched how his brain actually worked instead of terms designed, by accident, around brains that worked differently than his. He sat alone in that break room for almost 10 minutes before he told anyone, not savoring it exactly, just needing a few private minutes to let 4 years of failure and one 15 years overdue diagnosis finish settling into the same sentence. He was going to be a lawyer. He called Priya first. He called his father second. And Hector, who rarely cried in front of his son, cried on the phone for almost a full minute before he managed to say anything at all. The testing center for the 5th attempt put him in a smaller side room with 3 other candidates using accommodations, away from the main hall of 200 test takers he'd sat among 4 times before. A proctor handed him a pair of noise-canceling headphones wired to a laptop running the text-to-speech software he'd trained with for months. And for the first time across 5 attempts at this exam, Daniel didn't spend the first 20 minutes of the test fighting a rising sense of panic about the clock. He still worked hard. The accommodations didn't make the law easier, and they didn't make him smarter than he'd been the first 4 times. They just stopped costing him extra minutes on every single question simply for the act of reading it. Word got around the courthouse fast once he told his supervisor he'd passed, faster than Daniel expected for a man who'd spent 6 years trying not to make himself the center of attention in that building. By the next night shift, 3 different colleagues from the day staff had left him handwritten notes at the security desk, and one of the daytime bailiffs, a woman named Carla who'd worked there longer than almost anyone, told him she'd been quietly rooting for him since attempt number 2, when she'd noticed him rereading the same practice question out loud to himself at the desk and recognized, from her own son's experience, exactly what that habit usually meant. Passing the bar didn't make Daniel rich, and it didn't make the rest of his life easy, and it's worth saying that plainly, because the realistic version of this story matters more than the inspiring one. He took a job as a public defender, a position that paid barely more than the security job he was leaving, with caseloads that would have been unmanageable even without his particular relationship to reading dense files under deadline. He stayed anyway, for 9 years, because the clients walking into his office were, almost without exception, versions of his own father. People who didn't understand the paperwork that was about to determine the next several years of their lives. People who needed someone in the room who'd actually take the time to explain it instead of rushing them toward a plea deal that was convenient for everyone except them. He brought the same habit from his guard station nights into his legal career without much fanfare. Clients who couldn't afford bus fare to their own hearings sometimes found cash quietly left with the court clerk in an unmarked envelope. Daniel never confirmed where it came from, and the clerks who worked with him long enough stopped asking. It wasn't charity he wanted credit for. It was the same instinct that used to hand out granola bars at 1 in the morning, just with slightly higher stakes attached. He was appointed to the bench 11 years after passing the bar exam, following a path that involved more politics, more waiting, and more disappointment than any tidy summary can really capture. 2 failed applications to judicial vacancies before the third one finally went through, each rejection landing with an uncomfortable echo of the 4 bar exam failures that had come before them. When the appointment finally came, the assignment that followed was almost coincidental, a scheduling matter more than a poetic decision by anyone above him. Courtroom 4, in the same county courthouse where he'd once locked the doors at 11 every night, was getting a new judge, and Daniel Ruiz's name was next on the rotation. Nobody planned the symmetry of it. Daniel didn't request that courtroom specifically, and for years afterward he'd tell people, a little sheepishly, that the universe doesn't usually hand out endings this clean, and he still wasn't sure what to do with the fact that, in his case, it had. One case stayed with him longer than most. A 19-year-old named Marcus had been assigned to Daniel after a shoplifting charge that, on paper, looked simple enough to plead out in an afternoon. Daniel sat with him for 40 extra minutes that most public defenders wouldn't have had room in their caseload to spare, asking questions until it became clear Marcus genuinely hadn't understood that the plea he'd been offered at his first appearance would have left him with a permanent record affecting future employment. Daniel got the charge reduced to a diversion program instead, the kind of outcome that doesn't make headlines but changes the entire shape of a young person's next decade. It was, Daniel said later, the closest he ever felt to repaying the version of help he'd needed and gotten from Whitfield, passed forward to someone who'd never know where the habit came from. The 2 failed judicial applications stung in ways that echoed the bar exam years more than Daniel expected them to. The first time, a more politically connected candidate got the nod. The second time, Daniel made it to a final interview round and was told, vaguely, that the committee wanted a bit more bench-adjacent experience before extending an offer, language that felt uncomfortably similar to the unhelpful vagueness of a failed bar exam score report. He almost didn't apply the third time, the echo of those 4 old rejection letters rising up uninvited, before Priya reminded him, in close to the exact words his mother had used over a decade earlier, that the only difference between this and the bar exam was whether he let it be. Judge Daniel Ruiz has presided over Courtroom 4 for 6 years now. The hallway outside still looks almost exactly the way it did when he used to walk it at 11 p.m. with a flashlight and a set of keys, checking that everything was locked up for the night. He keeps a box of granola bars in his chambers. His clerks know what it's for. He's never explained it to them directly, and they've learned not to ask, the same way the court clerks years ago learned not to ask about the unmarked envelopes. He still struggles with fast, dense reading under deadline, dyslexia being a difference, not a problem that gets cured by a diagnosis and a graduation. He reads case files with text-to-speech software running quietly through a single earbud, a tool he no longer feels any need to hide, in a building where he once hid an entire undiagnosed disability for 6 years without anyone, including himself, knowing its name. Hector Ruiz, 81 now, comes to watch his son work whenever his hip allows for the drive. He sits in the back row, the same kind of folding chair patience he once brought to a kitchen table the day his own shop closed. Except now he's watching it go right instead of watching it fall apart. Daniel doesn't tell defendants his own story from the bench. It isn't his courtroom's business, and he's careful about the line between empathy and overstepping. But people who've watched him work say there's something in how long he waits before responding to a stammering, underprepared public defender, something in the extra few seconds of patience he extends to a defendant who clearly didn't understand a form. That looks less like judicial procedure and more like a man who remembers exactly what it feels like to be the person the system wasn't built to wait for. For failures didn't disqualify him from this room. They're the entire reason he understands it. Priya still keeps the 4 old rejection letters in a folder in the hall closet, not displayed anywhere, just kept, the way you keep things that were once unbearable and have since become merely true. Daniel doesn't look at them often, but he knows exactly where they are, and some nights before a difficult ruling, that's oddly enough to settle him. If this one stayed with you, follow the channel, and if you know 5 people who need a story like this today, send it their way. That's how we keep finding the right people. Tell me honestly in the comments, how many times would you have tried? And tell me whose story you want to hear next. I read every one of them.